What would you do if you had lost everything? Your home, your family, your name, and all you had left were $3 silver and the clothes on your back. For 19-year-old Etta Sloan, this wasn't a question. It was the sharp-edged reality of her life in the autumn of 1882. She paid those last $3 for a deed to a pile of forgotten stones and rotten timbers. Everyone called the Blackwater Ruin an abandoned water mill on the edge of nowhere. They laughed at her, a girl buying a ghost. But the truth waiting inside, buried under the weight of a forgotten world, was a secret that would not only restore her name, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who bought a ruin and found a kingdom. The dust of the road had settled into the very weave of her dress, a fine red grit that felt like a second skin. Etta Sloan walked with a steadiness that belied the tremor in her heart, her worn-out boots scuffing softly on the packed earth of Hollow Creek's Main Street. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the hazy ridgeline that cupped the town, avoiding the curious and pitying glances from the doorways of the general store and the saloon. She knew what they saw. A girl too young to be so alone, her face smudged with fatigue, her father's old canvas satchel slung over a shoulder that seemed too slight to carry its meager weight. Inside was a spare shirt, a whetstone, a half-empty tin of coffee, and the heavy, invisible burden of grief. Her father, John Sloan, had been a miller, a man whose hands were always dusted with the fine, pale powder of his trade. He smelled of flour, sawdust, and honest work. He had taught her the language of the millstone, the song of the water wheel, the heft of a well-balanced tool. Then Silas Blackwood's bank had called in a note no one knew existed, and their world had crumbled like dry rotted wood. The mill was lost, then the house, and then, as if his heart could no longer bear the weight of a life's work undone, her father was gone too. She had buried him in a quiet churchyard 2 counties over, a simple wooden cross, her only monument to a life of substance. Now she was here, drawn by the whisper of a place where a person could disappear, or perhaps begin again. Her father's last words to her had been a fevered murmur, his eyes looking past her back in time. "The foundation," he'd whispered, his hand fluttering at his chest. Always check the foundation. She had thought it the ramblings of a dying man. Now, with nothing left, the words echoed with a strange and desperate weight. She had just enough money for a week's lodging and a few meals, and then she didn't let her mind venture that far. She passed the smithy, the air thick with the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel and the sharp scent of quenched metal. A group of men stood near the land office, laughing over something. Their laughter was loud, careless, the sound of men with full pockets and easy futures. One of them, a portly man in a waistcoat, too tight for his frame, pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the dark woods that climbed the mountain. "Heard Old Man Hemlock finally sold the deed to the Blackwater Ruin," he boomed. $3, can you imagine? Paying good money for a pile of wet rocks and splinters. The others chuckled. The man was Silas Blackwood. Etta's breath caught in her throat. She froze, half hidden by the corner of the livery stable, her knuckles white where she gripped the strap of her satchel. It was him, the man who had taken everything, the man whose name her father had cursed with his final ragged breaths. She listened, her body rigid, the dust and the distance of her journey falling away, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The world narrowed to that man's mocking voice and the object of his scorn. A worthless, abandoned mill, a place no one wanted, a place forgotten by everyone but the ghosts. And in that moment a seed of an idea, desperate and wild, took root in the barren soil of her grief. A ruin, a mill, a foundation. Etta spent that night in the cheapest boarding house in Hollow Creek, a cramped room under the eaves that smelled of boiled cabbage and old linen. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the single window, watching the moon trace a silver path across the unfamiliar rooftops. her father's last words turning over and over in her mind. The foundation. Always check the foundation. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she made her decision. It wasn't a choice born of hope, but of necessity. It was the only thing in the world she could afford. She washed her face in the cold basin, tied her hair back with a piece of twine, and walked out into the morning chill before the town was fully awake. The county clerk's office was a small, dusty room filled with the scent of aging paper and dry ink. A thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from a massive ledger, his expression a mixture of boredom and impatience. "Yes?" he asked, his voice reedy. Etta's own voice was quiet but steady. "I've come about a deed." She placed her 3 silver dollars on the polished wood of the counter. The coins were worn smooth, the last physical remnants of her old life. They made a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. The one for the old Blackwater Mill property. The clerk blinked. He looked from her young, earnest face to the coins, and then a slow smile spread across his lips. It was not a kind smile. "The Blackwater ruin?" he said, drawing out the last word as if savoring a private joke. "Child, you don't want that. The roof's gone, the wheels seized, and the creek floods it every spring. It's not worth the paper the deed is printed on." "I'll take it," Etta said, her gaze unwavering. The clerk shrugged, the smile turning into a smirk. He shuffled through a stack of loose papers in a dusty cubbyhole marked unclaimed and forfeit. He pulled one out, yellowed and creased, and smoothed it on the counter. $3 buys you 100 acres of rock, rattlesnakes, and rotten wood. Your name? Etta Sloan. He dipped his pen, scratched her name onto the document with a flourish, and sanded it dry. He pushed the paper toward her and swept the coins into a drawer. "Pleasure doing business with you, Miss Sloan," he said, the mockery plain in his voice. She took the deed, the paper dry and fragile in her hands. It felt impossibly light, yet it was the heaviest thing she had ever held. It was the first thing that was truly hers. She folded it carefully and placed it in her satchel, turning to leave without another word. The clerk was already laughing to himself, shaking his head as he returned to his ledger. She had just bought herself a ghost, a shelter made of memory and decay. It was nothing, and it was everything. What was she thinking? A girl of 19 with nothing to her name, buying a pile of rubble. Was it desperation, or did she feel something that everyone else had missed? What secrets can a place hold when left to the mercy of time and nature? Let us know what you would do in her shoes in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet courage. The mill had been waiting a long time for someone to listen, and Etta Sloan was finally on her way. As Etta stepped back out into the main street, the deed tucked safely away, the morning sun seemed harsher, the shadows deeper. The town, which had felt merely indifferent before, now felt actively hostile. Whispers followed her like burrs on a wool blanket. She heard the clerk's laughter echo from the office and saw 2 women by the mercantile stop their conversation, cover their mouths with their hands, and stare. She was the town's new fool, the subject of its morning gossip. She kept walking, her chin held high, her focus narrowed to the single task of gathering what few supplies she could afford with the change left in her pocket. A small sack of flour, a box of matches, and a cheap, sturdy knife. As she exited the general store, a large figure blocked her path. Silas Blackwood stood before her, his bulk filling the doorway, a gold watch chain glinting against his expansive waistcoat. His face was florid, his eyes small and assessing. He looked down at her, a sneer playing on his lips. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice carrying down the street. "If it isn't the little Sloan girl. I heard you came into an inheritance." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "Bought yourself a pile of rocks, did you? Following in your father's footsteps, it seems. A fondness for failed mills." The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. Etta flinched, the memory of her father's tired face, the shame in his eyes, rising hot and swift. She said nothing, merely clutched her small bag of supplies and tried to step around him. He shifted, blocking her again. "Let me give you some advice, girl," he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a confidential, condescending tone. "Some things are best left to rot. That place is a money pit. Your father learned that the hard way. You'd be wise to just walk away, cut your losses." He smiled, a predator's smile. "Though I suppose you have nothing left to lose." She met his gaze then, and for a fleeting second, the quiet intensity in her eyes seemed to give him pause. She still said nothing. There were no words for the cold fury that was coiling in her gut. Silence was her only shield, her only weapon. She sidestepped him again, and this time he let her pass, his mocking laughter following her down the street. Her cheeks burned, but she did not run. She walked with a deliberate, measured pace toward the edge of town, toward the path that led into the woods. Just as the last buildings gave way to tall pines, a voice, quiet and cracked as old leather, spoke from the shadows of a covered porch. "The girl with the paper." Etta stopped and turned. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and surprisingly clear. She was wrapped in a patchwork quilt despite the mildness of the day. Etta had not even noticed her sitting there. The woman, whom the townspeople called Elspeth and mostly avoided, was considered half-wheeled, a creature of the mountains, who only came to town for salt and thread. Elspeth's gaze was not pitying or mocking. It was knowing. She looked at Etta, then at the satchel where the deed was hidden, as if she could see right through the canvas. "They think the value is in the wood," the old woman said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But the deepest water runs under the stone." Etta stared, confused by the strange pronouncement. The woman simply nodded, once a slow, deliberate gesture, and turned her gaze back to the mountains. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Etta lingered for a moment, the woman's words hanging in the still air. "The deepest water runs under the stone." It made no more sense than her father's ramblings, yet it felt like a coin pressed into her hand, a thing of weight and value she did not yet understand. With a final uncertain glance at the unmoving figure on the porch, Etta turned and took the path into the forest, leaving the town and its judgment behind her. The real journey was about to begin. The path to the Blackwater Mill was less a path and more a memory of one. It wound upward from the valley floor, a faint track overgrown with ferns and choked by fallen branches. The air grew cooler, quieter, scented with damp earth and pine. The sounds of Hollow Creek, the smith's hammer, the rumble of wagon wheels, the voices of men faded behind her, replaced by the chatter of a squirrel and the sigh of the wind in the high canopy. Etta walked for more than an hour, her satchel growing heavier with each step. The land here was wilder, the trees older and thicker. She felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was not frightening. After the scrutiny of the town, the anonymity of the woods was a balm. Finally, she heard it, a low, steady murmur that grew into the rush of moving water. She followed the sound, pushing through a thicket of rhododendron, and then she saw it. The mill was a skeleton. It stood astride the fast-moving creek, a crumbling monument to forgotten industry. The great water wheel was locked in place, half submerged, its paddles furred with green moss and festooned with debris. Much of the roof had collapsed, leaving the upper floor exposed to the sky. The stone foundation was massive and dark, slick with moisture, but the wooden structure built upon it was a ruin of sagging beams and walls pocked with holes. It was worse than she had imagined, far worse. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The clerk's laughter, Blackwood's sneer, they were right. She had paid her last dollars for a pile of rot. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridge, casting long, distorted shadows that made the ruins seem even more desolate. A cool evening breeze stirred the leaves, and the first drops of a coming rain began to fall. Etta felt a familiar burn behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed shelter, and this wreck was all she had. She circled the structure, looking for any part that might offer protection from the rain. On the side facing away from the creek, a low overhang, where a loading dock might have once been, provided a sliver of dry ground. The space was barely large enough for her to sit with her back against the cold stone foundation. As she huddled there, pulling her thin coat tighter, a movement in the shadows caught her eye. Two glints of yellow, low to the ground. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. A stray dog, its ribs stark beneath a matted coat of gray fur, had claimed this meager shelter first. It was as thin and lost as she was. It watched her, wary and defensive. Etta slowly reached into her satchel and pulled out the small loaf of bread she'd bought, her dinner for that night and breakfast for the next. She broke off a piece and tossed it gently onto the ground between them. The dog flinched but didn't run. It eyed the bread, then her, its growl softening to a whine. After a long moment it crept forward, snatched the bread, and retreated back into the shadows to devour it. Etta broke off another piece. This time the dog took it more readily. She ate her own small portion in silence. As the rain began to fall in earnest, a steady, drumming rhythm on the broken roof above, the dog crept closer, eventually settling just a few feet away. It laid its head on its paws and let out a long, weary sigh. Etta leaned her head back against the cold, damp stone of her new home. She was not entirely alone. She closed her eyes, listening to the rush of the creek and the soft breathing of the stray dog, and for the first time in a long time she slept. The ruin held them both in its broken embrace. The next morning, Etta woke to the strange, dappled light, filtering through the holes in the mill's roof. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet stone and decaying leaves. Her body ached from the cold, hard ground, but her mind was clear. The despair of the previous evening had receded, replaced by a quiet, stubborn resolve. This place was hers. It was her duty to see it, to know it, before she could declare it a loss. The dog was still there, curled in a tight ball. He lifted his head as she stirred, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the dirt floor. She had no more bread to offer, but she gave him a soft word and a slow blink, a sign of peace she'd learned from her father for dealing with wary animals. She decided to call him Ash, for his gray coat and his appearance from the ashes of her own life. Leaving him to rest, Etta began her first true exploration of the mill. The ground floor was a cavern of debris. Rotted planks, rusted machine parts, and layers of silt and leaves covered everything. In the center of the vast room, like the heart of a dead giant, sat the millstone. It was a magnificent thing, a single, solid piece of French burstone, at least 4 feet in diameter and thick as a man's chest. It was not in its proper place. The massive wooden housing that should have held it, the ton, had splintered and collapsed, and the stone itself had shifted, coming to rest at a slight, unnatural angle on the floor. It was a symbol of the mill's complete failure, its very purpose broken and displaced. Etta spent the morning simply clearing a space, using a broken plank to scrape the muck and debris away from the center of the room. It was heavy, dirty work. Ash watched her, a silent, furry shadow. As she worked her way closer to the great stone, she began to notice something strange. The floor of the mill was mostly packed earth and rough-hewn flagstones, uneven and practical. But the area directly beneath the millstone was different. Here, the stones were flatter, more uniform, fitted together with a precision that was out of place with the rustic construction of the rest of the foundation. It was almost like a deliberate platform, a stage for the main event. She ran her hand over the surface. It was cool and smooth. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. The foundation. She knelt, peering closer at the giant millstone itself. It was covered in a fine layer of grime. Using the sleeve of her coat, she wiped at the curved edge of the stone, near the bottom where it met the peculiar floor, and there it was. Her first real clue, a small, faint carving, no bigger than her thumb, It was not a maker's mark, nor was it a random scratch from its fall. It was a deliberate shape, elegantly carved into the hard quartz of the birthstone, a single five-pointed star. It was so faint, so unexpected, that she almost dismissed it. Anyone else would have. But Etta had spent her childhood in a mill. She knew these stones. They were commodities, tools. They were marked for weight or origin, but never decorated, never personalized. A star. Why would anyone carve a star on the side of a millstone? It refused to fit. The precise stone floor beneath, the cryptic carving on the side. It was a discordant note in the ruined symphony of decay. She didn't understand it, not yet. But as she stood there, her fingers tracing the faint outline of the star, a flicker of something other than desperation sparked within her. It was curiosity. The mill had spoken its first word, and she was beginning to listen. Days bled into weeks. Etta's life found a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the broken mill. Her first priority was shelter. She scavenged planks from the collapsed sections of the structure, painstakingly pulling out rusted nails, and began to patch a small corner of the roof over the main floor. It was slow, arduous work. Her hands, soft from a year of idleness and grief, quickly became calloused, then blistered, then calloused again. She learned the feel of the wood, the heft of the stones, the way the light moved through the space during the day. She and Ash developed a quiet partnership. He would follow her as she worked, a silent sentinel, and at night, they would share the warmth of a small, carefully managed fire she built in a makeshift hearth of stacked stones. He was her only companion, and his steady presence was a constant grounding comfort. Every day, her work would bring her back to the center of the room, to the mystery of the millstone. The strange, perfect section of floor and the star carved on the stone's edge became a focal point in her mind. She swept it clean daily, studying it from every angle. The words of the old woman, Elspeth, returned to her. The deepest water runs under the stone. Was it a literal warning about the creek or something more? One afternoon, driven by a frustration she couldn't name, she took the old crowbar she had found amidst the debris and tried to pry at the edge of one of the finely fitted flagstones beneath the millstone. She wedged the tip into a hairline crack and threw her entire weight against it. The bar groaned, but the stone didn't move. It was sealed, as if it were one solid piece. Defeated, she sat back on her heels, breathing heavily, her gaze falling once more upon the star carving. She traced its shape again, the 5 points, the clean lines. It was then that a memory, faint and dusty as old flour, surfaced in her mind. She was a little girl, sitting on a stool in her father's office as he worked on his ledgers. He wasn't just writing numbers. He was sealing a letter, and before he pressed his signet ring into the hot wax, he showed it to her. The signet was not the family initial, but a small, perfect star. "It's the miller's mark, Etta," he had said, his voice warm and proud. "Passed down from my grandfather. It means the work is true. It means it's ours." Her breath caught. It wasn't just a star, it was his star, her family's mark, a mark of ownership, of identity. She scrambled back to the stone, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a random decoration. It was a sign, a message left by someone who knew the miller's mark. Her grandfather? Her great-grandfather? The labor of the past weeks had changed her. She was no longer just a grieving girl. Her hands had learned the language of the mill, and now her mind was beginning to understand its grammar. The star wasn't just a clue, it was a key. The floor wasn't just a platform, it was a lock. Her father's words and Elspeth's cryptic message began to converge into a single point of startling clarity. The foundation, the stone. She looked from the carving to the sealed floor, and a wild, incredible thought began to take shape. The treasure of the Blackwater Mill wasn't the structure itself, but something hidden deep within its heart, waiting for someone who knew the sign. The realization settled over Etta not with a crash, but with a profound and sudden stillness. The star was not on the stone, it was the key. She looked closer at the carving, her fingers tracing the outline with a new, trembling reverence. It wasn't just etched into the surface. There were faint, almost invisible seams around it. It was a separate piece, inlaid with masterful precision. Her knife. She retrieved the cheap, sturdy blade from her belt, its point honed sharp on her father's old whetstone. With the care of a surgeon, she inserted the very tip into one of the hairlines and gently, carefully began to pry. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a faint click, the small stone star loosened. It came free in her hand, a solid piece of granite shaped and fitted perfectly. It felt warm, alive. As she lifted it out, she heard a low, grinding sound from below. Stone on stone. Her eyes darted to the floor beneath the great millstone. A single, large flagstone, the one she had tried and failed to move with the crowbar, had shifted, a dark crack appearing along its edge. It had a recessed hole, previously hidden, just large enough to fit her fingers. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. With Ash whining softly at her side, sensing her agitation, she knelt and pulled. The stone was heavy, but it lifted, pivoting on a hidden mechanism. Beneath it was not dirt or bedrock, but a dark, square cavity, lined with slate to keep out the damp. It was a hidden chamber, a stone safe. She reached for her lantern, her hands shaking so badly, it took 2 tries to strike a match. The flame caught, casting a warm, golden glow. She lowered the lantern into the opening. The light fell upon a tin box, dark and sealed with wax. It was an old biscuit tin, but it had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. Time had stood still in this small, dark space. With painstaking slowness, she lifted the box out. It was heavier than it should have been. She set it on the floor and used her knife to break the brittle wax seal and pry open the lid. The first thing she saw was a deerskin pouch, tied shut with a leather thong. It was soft and worn, and when she lifted it, it was surprisingly heavy. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with anticipation. She untied it and tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't coins. It was a soft, glittering stream of gold dust fine as flour, shimmering in the lantern light. A fortune, a miller's fortune hidden away. Her breath hitched in a sob. But beneath the pouch was something else, something more important. It was another object wrapped in oilcloth, a document folded and protected. She unwrapped it carefully. The paper was old, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, in elegant script, it read, "Deed of trust and title for the Blackwater Creek Mill." The date was 1835. It was the original deed, but it was the papers tucked inside it that made her stop breathing. It was a ledger page and a signed, witnessed letter. The letter was a confession, written by a man named Alastair Finch, who described himself as the original partner of her great-grandfather, Elias Sloane. In a trembling hand, he detailed how a young, ambitious banker named Silas Blackwood had used threats and forgery to force him out, stealing the deed and creating a fraudulent chain of ownership that eventually led to the ruin of the Sloane family. Blackwood hadn't just foreclosed on her father. He had stolen the mill from their family 2 generations ago. It was all there. The proof, the truth. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the ruins of her family's legacy, Etta Sloane finally understood. Her father hadn't lost the mill. It had been stolen, and she, standing in its broken heart, had just stolen it back. Just as the enormity of her discovery settled upon her, the world outside began to change. The gentle afternoon light dimmed unnaturally, and the wind, which had been a soft sigh all day, began to howl through the gaps in the walls, a low, rising moan. A storm was coming. Not a simple rain shower, but one of the violent, fast-moving tempests that could swell the creek and turn the valley into a torrent. Etta quickly placed the deed and the gold dust back into the tin box, closed the stone lid of the secret chamber, and slid the great millstone back as best she could to cover the seam. This secret had kept for 50 years. It would have to keep for one more night. She had to protect her home. The first sheets of rain hit the patched roof like handfuls of gravel. The sky turned a bruised purple-black. Thunder cracked overhead, so close it shook the very stones of the foundation, and lightning bleached the interior of the mill in stark, momentary flashes. The creek was rising, its gentle murmur transforming into an angry roar. Water began to lick at the lower edges of the foundation, seeping in through the cracks. This was her test. The wild, desperate idea that had brought her here had borne fruit. But now, nature itself seemed intent on washing it all away. She could run, take the precious box, and flee to higher ground, leaving the mill to its fate. But as she looked around the ruin, at the small space she had cleared, the roof she had patched, the hearth where she and Ash had shared their warmth, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just a ruin anymore. It was hers. She and Ash huddled near the small fire, which spat and hissed as stray drops of rain found their way down. The wind tore at her makeshift roof, and she heard a large section of rotted timber groan, and then crash down somewhere on the far side of the building. The storm was trying to reclaim the mill. In the midst of the gale's fury, a new light appeared, bobbing and faint through the curtain of rain. A lantern. It moved unsteadily toward the mill. A man's voice, desperate and thin against the wind, called out, "Hello, is anyone there? Help!" Etta grabbed her own lantern and went to the main doorway. A man was staggering toward her, half carrying a woman who was leaning heavily on him, while a small child clung to his leg. Their wagon, visible in a flash of lightning, lay on its side 50 yards away, one of its wheels shattered. "Our wagon, the axle broke," the man shouted over the storm. "My wife, the baby's coming soon, we need shelter, please." Etta looked at them, their soaked clothes, their terrified faces, the woman's obvious distress. Just weeks ago, she had been the one who was homeless, shelterless, at the mercy of the world. Now here in the heart of her ruin, she was the one who had shelter to offer. "Come in," she said, her voice clear and strong against the wind. "Hurry." She led them to the driest spot, near her small fire. She gave the woman her only blanket and brewed the last of her coffee for them. The family, whose name was Miller, looked around the cavernous, leaking space with wide, grateful eyes. It was a wreck, but it was a haven from the storm's rage. As the storm raged on, Etta sat with them, a quiet protector in her own broken castle. She was no longer just the inheritor of a secret. She was the steward of a sanctuary. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind gentled, the rain softened to a drizzle, and a pale, watery light began to filter into the mill. The Miller family had huddled together and slept from sheer exhaustion. Mrs. Miller was resting as comfortably as possible, her husband watching over her with a grateful, weary expression. The creek was still a torrent, but it had crested just below the main floor of the mill. Etta's home had held. When the family awoke, Mr. Miller, a carpenter by trade, couldn't stop thanking her. "You saved us, miss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Truly, we'd have been lost out there." Before they prepared to hike back to town, he insisted on repaying her kindness. With Etta's help, he used the crowbar and some scavenged rope to brace a dangerously weakened support beam that the storm had nearly taken down. "It's not much," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "but it'll hold you until you can fix it proper." When the Millers finally left, they promised to send someone back for their wagon and to tell everyone in town of the girl at the Blackwater Mill who had given them sanctuary. Etta watched them go, then turned her attention back to the tin box. It was time. She cleaned herself as best she could, put on her spare shirt, and with the precious deed and a small pinch of the gold dust tucked securely in her satchel, she and Ash began the walk back to Hollow Creek. The town felt different this time. Or perhaps she was different. She walked with a purpose that she lacked before. Her first and only stop was the county clerk's office. Mr. Abernathy looked up, a flicker of annoyance on his face, which quickly turned to surprise when she placed the ancient oilcloth-wrapped deed on his counter. I believe you have this on file as forfeit, she said quietly. But this is the original title. I'd like to register it. Abernathy scoffed, but he took it. He unrolled the document, his eyes scanning the old script. His expression began to change. He read the date, the signatures, the property description. He then pulled out his own ledger, the one with the forged chain of title. He compared them, his finger tracing the lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. The room was silent for a long time. "My God," he finally whispered, looking up at her. His derisive smirk completely gone, replaced by awe. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the foundation," Etta said simply. The news, combined with the Miller family's dramatic story of their rescue, swept through Hollow Creek like a flash flood. The girl who bought the ruin, the girl who weathered the storm, the girl who sheltered a family, the fool had become a figure of folklore overnight. Silas Blackwood heard the rumors. He saw Mr. Abernathy hurrying toward the sheriff's office with the deeds in his hand. Late that afternoon, Blackwood rode out to the mill himself. He found Etta calmly clearing debris near the water wheel. He dismounted, his usual bluster gone. His face was pale, his movements stiff. He looked at the ruin, then at the quiet, determined girl who was now its master. He saw the truth in her steady, unflinching gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten or bargain, but no words came out. He was a man built on a foundation of lies, and she had just shown everyone the bedrock beneath. Humbled and exposed, he turned without a word, mounted his horse, and rode away, a smaller man than the one who had arrived. The townspeople's whispers had not stopped, but their tone had changed. Laughter had become reverence. Mockery had turned to respect. Months passed. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the gold and rust of late autumn. The Blackwater Mill was no longer a skeleton. With the help of Mr. Miller and a few other men from town, paid fairly with a small amount of the hidden gold, the roof was fully repaired. New windows were set in the walls, and the main floor was cleared and swept clean. The great water wheel, its axle repaired and gears cleaned, now turned slowly in the current. It wasn't grinding grain yet. The massive millstone still sat silent in the center of the room, its secret kept by Etta. But its movement was a sign of life, a steady heartbeat restored to the valley. The legal battle had been quiet but decisive. The original deed, authenticated by experts from the state capital, was irrefutable. Silas Blackwood's empire, built on a half-century of deceit, crumbled. He sold his assets, including the bank, and left Hollow Creek in disgrace, his departure as unceremonious as his reign had been arrogant. Etta Sloane was no longer the homeless girl. She was the rightful owner of the mill and the surrounding 100 acres. She was a landowner, a part of the community, her name restored and respected. In the warm light of a late afternoon, Etta stood on the newly built porch that overlooked the creek. Ash, now healthy and with a glossy sea, sat loyally at her feet, his head resting on her boot. The turning of the water wheel was a peaceful, rhythmic sound, a promise of work to come. A farmer on his way home from town paused his wagon on the nearby track. He tipped his hat. "Evenin', Miss Sloane," he called out, his voice full of genuine admiration. "You've built yourself a fine mill, a real fine mill." Etta watched the water churn and foam around the wheel, the setting sun glinting off its wet paddles. A small, quiet smile touched her lips. She had done more than repair some wood and stone. She had reclaimed a history, honored a legacy. She thought of her father, of his pride and his pain, and of the truth that had lain dormant for so long. She turned her gaze from the water to the solid stone foundation beneath her feet. "I didn't build a mill," she murmured, her voice soft enough that only Ash and the whispering creek could hear it. "I just remembered where the foundation was." Thank you for staying with us through Etta's journey to reclaim her past and build her future. This was a story about the quiet strength of remembering, and how the things we inherit are so often more than just property. If you were moved by her story of resilience and vindication, Let us know in the comments. And please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of hidden history and the power of the human spirit. We'll be back soon with another story waiting to be uncovered. What would you do if the world had taken everything from you? If, at 19 years old, you were left with nothing but the clothes on your back, a handful of coins, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second shadow? For Pearl Aldridge in the unforgiving Nevada Territory of 1884, this wasn't a question. It was the dust in her throat and the ache in her bones. She had been cast out, disowned by the family that took her in after her father's death, all because she refused to marry a man twice her age. So she paid $2, nearly everything she had, for a deed to a place no one wanted, a derelict blacksmith's forge, abandoned and rotting on the edge of a town that had already decided she was a fool. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten place, buried in the heart of the very thing that defined it, was a secret that would not only rewrite her future, but the town's entire history. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of iron, integrity, and the enduring value of what is dismissed. Pearl Aldridge arrived in the town of Red Pine under a sky the color of a faded bruise. She stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her movements stiff from the long journey. She carried a single carpet bag that held all her worldly possessions, a change of clothes, her father's worn leather-bound journal of smithing techniques, and a small tin box with $17 inside. The wind that swept down from the high desert plateau was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and bitter sage. It felt like a warning. She had lost her father to a fever 6 months prior, and with him the warmth and purpose of their small but thriving smithy. He had been her world, a man whose strength was measured not just in the muscles of his arms, but in the quiet kindness of his eyes. After his passing, her aunt and uncle, her only remaining family, saw her not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a burden to be traded. Her refusal to be sold into a loveless marriage had been met with a slammed door and a single final word, "Go," and so she had gone. She walked through the main street of Red Pine, a single artery of dust and commerce, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked tired and temporary. Men on the boardwalk of the saloon stopped their talking to watch her pass, their gazes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and appraisal. She felt their eyes like a physical weight, another layer of exhaustion on her shoulders. She was young, alone, and visibly without means, a combination that made her vulnerable in a place like this. Her face, smudged with the dust of the road, was set in a mask of stoic resolve, a look she'd learned from her father when facing a piece of stubborn, unyielding iron. She ignored the whispers and the stares. Her focus narrowed to a single desperate task, finding shelter before her meager funds evaporated completely. She needed a roof, any roof, and a place where she could begin to piece her life back together, even if she had no idea what those pieces might look like. The town felt indifferent, a collection of hard people carved from a hard land, and she knew she could expect no charity here. Whatever she was to become, she would have to build it herself, with her own 2 hands. The thought was terrifying, but beneath the fear was a flicker of something else, a familiar spark her father had so often praised. It was the stubborn fire of the forge. She found her way to the land office, a cramped room that smelled of stale tobacco and brittle paper. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man with a slick, self-satisfied smile and a vest that strained at the buttons. His name was Silas Croft, and he was, as she would soon learn, a man who owned or had a stake in nearly everything in Red Pine. He looked up from his ledger, his eyes taking in her worn dress and the weary set of her shoulders. "Help you?" he asked, his tones suggesting he doubted it. Pearl straightened, forcing a confidence she did not feel. "I'm looking for a place to buy something small." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Buy, little lady. Property in Red Pine requires capital. You got capital? He leaned back, making a show of sizing her up. Pearl's hand instinctively went to the small bulge of coins in her pocket. I have some, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The man, Croft, let out a short, humorless laugh. He shuffled through a stack of deeds on his desk, his movements theatrical. Well, let's see what we can find for a woman of your considerable means. He pulled out a single, yellowed piece of paper and slid it across the desk. There is one property, he said, his smile widening. The old smithy, edge of town, been sitting empty for 5 years, ever since the last smith had the good sense to drink himself into an early grave. He named the price with a flourish, as if announcing a grand joke. $2, cash. The price was an insult, a clear signal of the property's worthlessness. A functioning forge, even a small one, was the lifeblood of a frontier town. One abandoned for so long was considered not just useless but cursed, a place of failure and bad luck. Pearl felt the sting of his condescension, but she also felt a pull she couldn't explain. A smithy. It was the only world she had ever known. I'll take it, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Croft's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise, quickly replaced by a look of predatory glee. He had expected her to be shamed, to slink away. He hadn't expected her to call his bluff. He quickly drew up the bill of sale, his pen scratching across the paper with finality. Pearl counted out $2 silver and pushed them across the desk. The coins looked small and insignificant on the vast, polished wood. As she took the deed, his smile returned, dripping with scorn. Good luck to you, Miss Aldridge, he said, the title feeling like another jab. You'll need it. As she walked out, the deed clutched in her hand. She could hear his low chuckle following her into the dusty street. She had a home, or at least she had the ghost of one. What was she thinking? Buying a place sight unseen. Why a forge of all things? A place of sweat and fire and back-breaking labor meant for a man twice her size. And what secret could possibly lie, waiting in a place so thoroughly abandoned that it was worth less than a decent meal? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as Pearl held the key to her future, the town of Red Pine prepared to make her regret it. The news of the transaction spread through Red Pine like a grass fire. By the time Pearl had spent another $1 on a sack of flour and a slab of salt pork at the general store, it seemed everyone knew. The purchase of the old forge was seen not as a desperate act of survival, but as the height of feminine folly. In the saloon that evening, Silas Croft held court, recounting the tale with theatrical embellishments. A slip of a girl, no older than 19, he boomed, his voice carrying over the low thrum of conversation. Walks in with eyes bigger than her purse and buys that scrap heap. $2. I'd have paid her to haul it away. The men around him roared with laughter, the sound sharp and cruel. They were hard men in a hard country, and they had little patience for what they perceived as weakness or stupidity. A woman trying to run a forge was a joke. A girl buying a cursed one was a tragedy they found deeply amusing. From that moment on, Pearl was no longer just a stranger. She was the town fool, a walking cautionary tale. As she walked the edge of town, seeking the path to her new property, the scorn was a palpable thing. Women pulled their children closer as she passed. Men tipped their hats with exaggerated, mocking courtesy. Whispers followed her like burrs on a saddle blanket. Thinks she's a blacksmith. Lost her mind, that one. Croft played her like a fiddle. Pearl kept her eyes fixed forward, her chin held high. The humiliation was a hot coal in her stomach, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her father had taught her that the true measure of a person wasn't how they acted in triumph, but how they bore their burdens in silence. She would bear this. As she paused by a trough to let her newly acquired mule, a sway-backed old creature named Gideon, she'd bought for $3, have a drink. An old woman sitting on a nearby bench caught her eye. She was Paiute, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. She had watched Pearl's progress through the town without judgment. As Pearl met her gaze, the woman spoke, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. "Some iron remembers the fire that made it," she said. The words were simple, yet they landed with a strange weight. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned her gaze back toward the mountains. Pearl didn't understand what she meant, not then. But the sentence lodged itself in her mind, a smooth, cool stone in the churning river of her anxiety. It felt less like a warning and more like a key, though she had no idea what lock it might fit. She tugged gently on Gideon's lead and continued on her way, the laughter of the town fading behind her, the old woman's cryptic words echoing in the sudden quiet. The path to the old forge was less a road and more a suggestion. A pair of faint ruts, overgrown with sagebrush and brittle weeds. It wound away from the relative order of red pine and into the scrubby, rock-strewn land that bled into the foothills. With Gideon plodding patiently behind her, Pearl followed the track, the deed clutched in her hand like a prayer. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of violent orange and soft violet. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper, broken only by the crunch of her worn boots on the dry earth and the sigh of the wind through the sparse pines. The forge was situated in a small, shallow basin set against a low bluff of red rock. It looked as if the land itself had tried to swallow it. From a distance, it was a dark, hunched shape, a wound on the landscape. As she drew closer, the full extent of its dereliction became brutally clear. It was worse, far worse, than she had imagined. The main roof of the workshop sagged in the middle, a great sway-backed beast on the verge of collapse. Half the shingles were gone, leaving the ribs of the structure exposed to the sky. The windows were gaping mouths filled with shattered glass, and the large double doors to the main workspace hung crookedly from broken hinges. A shroud of rust covered every piece of exposed metal, from the hinges to the rain barrel, to the discarded horseshoes littering the ground. The place didn't just look abandoned, it looked defeated. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The town's laughter echoed in her ears. They were right. She was a fool. This wasn't a home. It was a tombstone marking the grave of a failed enterprise. What had she done? Thrown away her last hopes on a pile of rotting wood and rusted iron. For a long moment, she just stood there, the enormity of her mistake pressing down on her. The last of the sun's light caught on a shard of broken glass, making it glitter like a false diamond. The beauty of it felt like a mockery. She had never felt so alone. Her father's face flashed in her memory, his strong hands, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal that always clung to him. He had built his life from nothing, with nothing but his skill and his will. He would not have given up. He would have seen the work that needed to be done, and he would have started. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Pearl tethered Gideon to a withered post oak. She wouldn't sleep inside tonight. The structure didn't look safe. Instead, she unrolled her thin bedroll on a patch of clear ground nearby, where she could watch the ruin of her new home. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the black sky. The forge groaned and creaked in the night wind, speaking a language of decay. She lay there, listening to its sad old voice, and felt a strange kinship with the broken-down building. They were two of a kind, discarded, weathered, and facing an uncertain dawn. The next morning, Pearl awoke to a world washed in the clean, pale light of dawn. The air was cold enough to make her breath mist, but the chill seemed to cut through the fog of her despair. She was stiff, hungry, and daunted, but she was not broken. She rose, ate a dry piece of bread, and looked at the forge. In the morning light, it looked less like a tomb and more like a challenge. Fueled by a stubbornness she inherited directly from her father, she decided to begin. She would not be beaten by splintered wood and rust. She started with the doors. They were too heavy to lift back onto their hinges alone. so she wrestled them shut as best she could and wedged them closed with a fallen roof beam, securing the entrance. She found a small, less damaged side door and forced it open with her shoulder, the shriek of rusted hinges echoing in the cavernous space. Light struggled to pierce the gloom, filtering through the grimy windows and the holes in the roof in dusty, ethereal shafts. The inside was a disaster. Everything was coated in a thick, greasy layer of dust, soot, and cobwebs. Old tools, rusted beyond recognition, lay scattered on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of damp rot and cold ashes. In the center of the room, like a pagan altar in a forgotten temple, stood the anvil. It was immense, a classic London pattern anvil, its hardened steel face pitted and scarred from years of use and neglect. It rested on a massive cast-iron base, a thick, ornate stump that was bolted to the floor. It was the heart of the forge, the one indispensable tool. Without it, the place was just a shed. Pearl walked toward it, her boots crunching on debris. She ran a hand over its surface, feeling the cold, rough texture of the metal. It was a beautiful piece of work, despite the abuse it had suffered. This was the kind of anvil her father had always dreamed of owning. As a shaft of sunlight broke through a grimy pane of glass and fell directly upon the anvil's base, something caught her eye. It was a line, almost invisible, running down the side of the heavy cast-iron stump. A seam. It was perfectly straight, too clean to be a crack from damage or a flaw in the casting. Blacksmiths' anvils, especially their bases, were typically cast in a single, solid piece for stability. A seam made no sense. Curious, she knelt for a closer look. She traced the line with her finger. It was deliberate. Then, she did what any smith would do to test a piece of iron. She picked up a small, discarded ball-peen hammer from the floor and tapped the base. Instead of the high, solid ring of solid cast iron, the sound was a dull, muted thud, a dead sound. It was the sound of something hollow, or something filled with a softer, sound-dampening material. She tapped it again, higher up. Thud. Then she tapped the horn of the anvil itself. Ping. The clear, bell-like tone she expected. The contrast was jarring. Something was wrong with the anvil. She tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was a strange old design she'd never seen before. A cheap imitation. But the quality of the anvil's face and horn suggested otherwise. It was a contradiction. A fine tool on a flawed or fake base. The detail lodged itself in her mind. A small, insistent question mark in the overwhelming chaos of the ruined forge. She had 1,000 more pressing tasks, but the dead sound of the anvil echoed long after the hammer was silent. Days turned into a week. Pearl's life fell into a rhythm of relentless, grueling labor. She rose with the sun and worked until her muscles screamed and the light failed. Her silent companion in this endeavor was Gideon, the old mule who would stand tethered just outside. His patient presence a quiet comfort. He would watch her with his dark, liquid eyes, occasionally letting out a soft, breathy snort as if in encouragement. Pearl began with the most critical task, the roof. She scavenged fallen timbers and usable shingles, learning to climb the precarious frame with a sureness that belied her fear. She patched the largest holes, creating a space that was, if not dry, at least drier. Her hands, already calloused from her life at her father's side, became tougher, mapped with new cuts and splinters. She swept out years of accumulated filth, the dust rising in thick clouds that choked her and coated her from head to toe. She unearthed the hearth, a great brick structure choked with ancient, solidified soot and debris. She shoveled it out by the bucketful, her arms and back aching with the strain. Slowly, painstakingly, the forge began to resemble a place of work again, rather than a place of decay. Throughout this labor, the anvil remained at the center of her world. It was too heavy to move, a silent, immovable monolith. Every task seemed to bring her back to it. She would clear the space around it, stack salvaged tools near it, and often, at the end of the day, sit on a nearby crate and stare at it as she ate her meager meal of bread and dried meat. The more she worked in its presence, the more the initial anomaly of the dead-sounding bass bothered her. It was a dissonant note in the song of the smithy she was trying to revive. She remembered her father's teachings. "Listen to the metal, Pearl," he would say, his voice gentle over the roar of the fire. "It tells you what it needs. It tells you what it is." She had spent her life listening to iron, learning its language of heat, stress, and sound. And this anvil was telling her a story she didn't understand. One afternoon, while trying to clear the floor around its base, she found that the massive bolts holding it down were not as secure as they appeared. One was loose, its threads stripped. Another was sheared off entirely. It was anchored but poorly. It was almost as if it had been set in place hastily by someone who didn't know or didn't care about the proper way to seat an anvil for heavy work. A true smith would never be so careless. The anvil was the soul of the shop. Its stability was paramount. This carelessness, combined with the hollow sound and the strange seam, began to form a disturbing hypothesis in her mind. This anvil wasn't just a tool. It was a container. The thought was absurd, but it refused to be dismissed. It clung to her as she worked, a persistent whisper beneath the sounds of her labor. The suspicion became an obsession. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, Pearl decided she could ignore it no longer. The forge was tidier now, the floor mostly cleared. It was time to solve the riddle of the anvil. She lit a single lantern, its golden light pushing back the deep shadows of the workshop and casting her own long, dancing silhouette against the wall. She approached the anvil not as a smith, but as an investigator. With the lantern held close, she knelt and examined the seam on the base once more. This time, she wasn't just looking, she was searching. Her fingers, now sensitive to the slightest imperfection in metal, traced the line, feeling for a catch, a latch, a hidden spring. Her father had been a master of mechanical puzzles, creating intricate locks and trick boxes in his spare time. He had taught her to see how things fit together, to look for the maker's hidden mark. And she found it. Tucked away within the ornate cast-iron scrollwork at the bottom of the base was a tiny, almost imperceptible nub of metal. It looked like a casting flaw, a drip of excess iron, but when she pushed it, it moved. There was a faint, grinding click from within the base. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Using the flat edge of a cold chisel as a lever, she inserted the tip into the seam near the bottom and pried. The metal groaned in protest. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, scraping shriek, a section of the heavy cast-iron base swung outward on a hidden hinge. It was a door, brilliantly concealed, its weight and design making it nearly undetectable. She peered into the dark cavity, the lantern light trembling in her hand. The hollow chamber was not empty. It was filled almost to the top with a lumpy, misshapen mass of cool, dark metal. Her first thought was lead, or perhaps pewter scrap, saved for casting into weights or bullets. It seemed a strange thing to hide so carefully. She reached in and touched the surface. It was heavy, far heavier than lead. She scraped at it with the corner of the chisel. Where she scratched the dark, sooty surface, a deeper color gleamed in the lantern light. A soft, rich, unmistakable yellow, gold. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a solid mass of it, melted down from coin or bullion, and poured into the anvil base to cool, a fortune. As her eyes adjusted to the dark space, she saw something else, tucked into a small crevice beside the solid gold mass. It was a small package, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. Her fingers trembling, she retrieved it. She unwrapped the layers of preserved skin. Inside, nestled on a bed of old wool, was a small, heavy cylinder of hardened steel. She held it up to the light. One end was intricately carved with the face of liberty, the other with the heraldic eagle of a United States dollar coin. It was a die stamp, a masterfully crafted, perfect die for minting currency. It was also, she knew with chilling certainty, completely illegal. It was a counterfeiter's die, Just as the weight of her discovery settled upon her, the world outside began to change. The wind, which had been a constant sigh around the forge, rose to a mournful howl. The sky, visible through the patched roof, had turned a bruised, ominous gray. A storm was coming. Not a simple prairie squall, but a real teeth-bared blizzard, the kind that could descend on the high desert with shocking speed. Even in the late autumn, the temperature plummeted. The first flakes of snow, thick and wet, began to fall, melting against the grimy windows before quickly starting to stick. Pearl hurriedly closed the hidden compartment in the anvil base, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a note of finality. The gold and the dye were hidden again, but their presence filled the small workshop with a dangerous energy. She had no time to process her discovery. Survival was now the only priority. She stuffed rags into the cracks around the doors and windows, trying to fend off the biting wind. She piled her remaining wood near the hearth, knowing the fire would be her lifeline. The storm hit with full fury. Snow fell in a blinding horizontal sheet, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. The old forge groaned and shuddered under the assault, and Pearl felt a primal fear she hadn't known since she was a small child. Hours passed. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of white. The forge, once her prison of shame, had become her fortress. Huddled by the hearth, the fire casting a warm, protective glow, she listened to the storm's rage. It was in the midst of this tempest that she heard a new sound, a desperate shouting, nearly lost in the gale. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a faint, bobbing light. A lantern, a wagon, its shape nearly obscured by the snow, had foundered not 50 yards from her forge, one of its wheels shattered in a deep rut. Through the blizzard, she could make out figures, a man struggling against the wind, and another shape huddled in the wagon. Without a second thought for her own safety, Pearl grabbed her own lantern, wrapped her thin coat tighter, and plunged into the storm. The wind tore at her, the snow stinging her face. She fought her way to the wagon. Inside was a young man, his face etched with panic, and his wife, pale and obviously pregnant, wrapped in a threadbare blanket alongside a small, shivering child. "Our axle broke," the man yelled over the wind. "We were headed for the pass. The rancher down the way, a Mr. Croft, he turned us out, said he had no room." Pearl's jaw tightened at the mention of Silas Croft's name. "Come with me," she commanded, her voice strong against the storm. "There's shelter. It's not much, but it's warm." She helped the man guide his wife and child through the blinding snow, back to the fragile safety of the forge. She sat them by the fire, sharing her meager broth and blankets. As the storm raged outside, the old, forgotten blacksmith's shop, purchased for $2 in scorn, became a sanctuary. In that moment, protecting this family, Pearl made a silent choice. The gold in the anvil was a secret, a danger, but the forge itself, this place she had rebuilt with her own hands, was a home, and she would defend it. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of snow covered everything, muffling all sound and reflecting the bright, cold sunlight. The young family, whose names were John and Mary, were weak but safe. Their gratitude toward Pearl was immense and humbling. As soon as the drifts were passable, John made his way into Red Pine to seek help and parts to repair his wagon. The story he told was not about his misfortune, but about his rescue. He spoke of the girl in the old forge, the one the town had laughed at, who had taken his family in from a blizzard that would have surely killed them, giving them her own food and warmth when the wealthiest man in the valley had turned them away. The story rippled through the community, planting the first seeds of doubt about their collective judgment. At the same time, another stranger arrived in town, a man whose presence caused a different kind of stir. He was a United States Marshal named Elias Vance, a tall, quiet man with weary eyes that missed nothing. He had been tracking a sophisticated counterfeit currency operation for months, a trail of false silver dollars that had poisoned the economy of the entire territory. The trail, he announced in the saloon, had gone cold right here in Red Pine. Pearl heard of the marshal's arrival from John when he returned with a borrowed wheel. She knew she could not keep her secret. The gold was a temptation, but the die stamp was a crime. It was a poison, just like the counterfeit coins, and it was sitting in the heart of her home. Her father had taught her that a smith's work must be true. The metal must be honest, the welds strong, the purpose clear. To keep the die, to benefit from a crime, would be a betrayal of everything he had stood for. That afternoon she walked into town, her face clean, her shoulders straight, and went directly to the hotel where the marshal was staying. She found him in the lobby and, in a low, steady voice, told him she had something he needed to see. Marshal Vance, intrigued by her earnestness, followed her back to the forge. In the quiet, sunlit workshop, she knelt and opened the hidden compartment of the anvil. The marshal's eyes widened, first at the sheer mass of gold, then at the small, deadly object she placed in his hand. He examined the die stamp, comparing it with a coin from his own pocket. "This is it," he murmured, a note of awe in his voice. "This is the source." He looked around the forge, then at Pearl. He realized the former smith, the man who had supposedly drunk himself to death, was the counterfeiter. And his sudden death 5 years ago was likely not an accident, but a silencing. The marshal's gaze grew sharp. Who was this smith's closest associate in town, he asked. Pearl didn't have to answer. Everyone in Red Pine knew the man who had grown suddenly, inexplicably wealthy around the time the old smith died. The man who had a reputation for cutting corners and associating with unsavory characters. The man who had sold Pearl the forge for a laugh. Silas Croft. The town's laughter had ceased entirely. It was replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The vindication was not loud, but it was absolute. Marshal Vance didn't arrest Silas Croft on the spot. There wasn't enough direct proof to tie him to the old smith's murder, but the investigation he launched was swift and thorough. He impounded Croft's ledgers, questioned his associates, and put a microscope to his finances. The counterfeit die, found on property Croft had so smugly sold, cast a long, dark shadow from which he could not escape. His bluster evaporated, replaced by a sullen, fearful silence. The men who had laughed with him in the saloon now avoided his gaze. His empire of reputation, built on arrogance and ill-gotten gains, crumbled into dust. The community, in its quiet frontier way, passed its own sentence. Doors closed to him. Credit dried up. His mockery of Pearl had become his own downfall. The townspeople now looked at Pearl with a mixture of awe and shame. They had seen her as a fool, a fragile girl playing with a man's tools. They saw her now as she was, a woman of quiet strength, unshakable integrity, and a skill that ran deeper than muscle. She had faced down a blizzard, saved a family, and uncovered a crime that had been festering in their midst for years. The gold, a fortune that could have changed her life, was confiscated as federal evidence. Pearl was given a modest official reward for her role in the recovery, enough to live on for a year and properly outfit her forge, but not enough to make her rich. She didn't mind. The gold had been a burden. Her true reward was the forge itself. It was hers, truly hers now, earned not just with $2 but with sweat, faith, and moral clarity. People started coming to her, not with mockery, but with work. A farmer needed a plowshare mended. A rancher needed a custom branding iron. The livery needed a steady supply of horseshoes. They came to her forge, and they found not just a smith but an artisan. Her work was clean, strong, and honest, just like her father's had been. She became a fixture in the life of Red Pine, her presence as steady and essential as the anvil that stood in the center of her workshop. The forge was no longer a place of failure, but a symbol of resilience, its rhythmic heartbeat of hammer on iron, a new pulse for the town. One evening, as the sun set and cast long golden rays of light through the open doors of the forge, John, The man she had rescued from the storm came to see her. His wagon was repaired, and his family was ready to continue their journey west. His wife, Mary, had given birth to a healthy baby boy in town, and they had named him Aldridge in her honor. John stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, a humble gratitude in his eyes that was worth more to Pearl than all the gold in the world. He looked around the clean, orderly workshop, at the tools hanging in their proper places, at the warm glow of the banked fire in the hearth. "It's amazing what you've made of this place," he said softly. "After all that, after everything you went through, what was it you really found in here, Miss Aldridge?" Pearl looked away from him, toward the great anvil that had been the source of so much turmoil and ultimately so much truth. She laid a hand on its scarred, steady surface, the metal still warm from the day's work. She thought of her father, of the town's scorn, of the hidden gold, and of the family she saved. A small, serene smile touched her lips. "Just a place to make something true," she said. "Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet triumph. It's a powerful reminder that our real worth isn't found, but forged." If you were moved by Pearl's journey, please give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that honor the strength of the human spirit. We'll see you next time.